Welcome to the Moulding Private Practice Show, where we help healthcare practitioners in private practice keep true to their purpose and build a life of mastery by providing the knowledge, skills, and tools to bring their dreams to life. In this episode of the show, we speak to Claire Haggard about being a clinical psychologist and everything private practice management related. Claire Haggard, welcome to the show. So we're really glad to have you on board. And speaking about being a clinical psychologist and private practice, welcome on board.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today.
Yeah, the pleasure is always ours. And like I said just before the show, we love this conversation because it's, everyone has their unique story. And we've been doing this for quite some time, but I promise you, every story is different for practitioners, which is very interesting for me. But to kick it off, I just want to ask Shaz, Shaz, how did your and Claire's paths cross?
Oliver, it must have been maybe a little bit more than a year ago. Claire and I connected on LinkedIn, but there was a post that she put up, and I sort of commented on that. And when we started doing the Moulding shows, I started reaching out to people that I was connected to on LinkedIn, and I reached out to Claire for our Moulding Health show, and she was really keen to jump on board there. So she was happy to join us for the Moulding Private Practice as well.
Thanks very much for doing that. It's always a brave step. But I've been so amazed at the responses that we've had from practitioners. Because when it started out, I thought, I don't know if we're going to get practitioners, but it's the responses have been amazing. Thanks for doing that.
It's a pleasure.
So this is my favorite question out of all of the shows, and when I ask it is, and we kind of stumbled onto this question, but you know how they always ask you, like before you grade 3, what do you want to be when you grow up? So what did a young Claire say she wanted to be? Was it clinical psychologist?
No, I wanted to be, it was a series of things. I wanted to be a hairdresser. I wanted to be a musician because I studied music along with psychology at university. So I wanted to be a musician from early, because I played from early. What else did I want to be? A rugby player was one of them.
Wow.
Yes, I wanted to be a rugby player. I wanted to go to the boys' school because I saw that they played rugby. I really enjoyed watching rugby with my dad. So there was that. And I wanted to be a vet. And psychologist was never quite on the list. In fact, I'm not sure that I was really that aware as a youngster about psychologists necessarily. But certainly had a lot of people in my sphere who were involved in helping professions, whether that be more alternative practices, some doctors, things like that, but always had an awareness of people close to me in helping or healing professions. And I think I always was exceptionally empathic as a young child. I was a very sensitive child, so often drawn towards a melancholic child, drawn towards the tragedy of human life and feeling it very intensely. Yeah.
That's so interesting. So again, I go with my initial hypothesis that it is so unique with different practitioners. I would have never guessed rugby player. So yeah, I would have lost that bet every single time.
I was dedicated to that at a particular age.
No, very interesting. So when did the spark start? I can kind of see the vet part, based on what you said, always in touch with that side. And obviously the feeling and, maybe like almost the empathy part, maybe, because I think that's what psychologists need. So when was that spark, and what was the trajectory from there to you actually becoming a clinical psychologist?
I think the spark probably came when my grandfather, so my maternal grandfather, was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's when I was probably about 7 or 8. And it had a quite significant impact on the family, because at that time, so this is kind of, I guess, the early 90s, late 80s, actually, early 90s, wasn't really a lot known about Alzheimer's, and there wasn't really a lot in the way of medical or psychopharmacological intervention and support to assist with behavioral difficulties that often are attached with the cascading decline that happens. And my grandmother had to make the very difficult decision of having him admitted to the psychiatric hospital in the town that I grew up in Grahamstown. And he was there until he passed away. But we visited him on essentially a daily basis. He came home for weekends, and I spent a lot of time in a psychiatric, neuropsychological ward. And I think because I also grew up in a family who are quite, I guess, compassionate and very sort of caring individuals, there was also a sense of, my grandmother was remarkable with the group of patients in the unit. And so she took it upon herself she had a number of individuals who she actively cared for in the absence of family members being there. And I guess I learned, and I saw this, and I saw the sense of community, and I saw this, and I was very aware of very different presentations, I guess, of human distress. And it always stayed with me. I was never fearful of being in that particular ward. I think now, when I'm a parent myself, I don't think I would ever take a child into those kinds of spaces. But I think it was very different, I guess, different time, different understandings, and I was there. And then I guess I sort of went about my way, but always, I also grew up on a farm, so I was very aware of life and death and the birth of animals. And so there was something, I think, that just was always bringing me very close to kind of just, I guess, life and the multiplicity of manifestations of distress and joy, and that are attached to that. And then I went to university, and I was registered to do a biochem degree. My father's a physicist, and my mother is an artist. And my father, I think, will probably acknowledge that I think for a very long time he struggled with the fact that his daughter decided to deregister from biochem and do general psych and music, and it's soft science, psychology, and so there was a lot of trepidation about that. And I did my undergrad, and I'm not even sure that I knew that I was going to become a psychologist then. I decided to do psychology honors because I felt that that would offer me more opportunities. I was also very interested in, I've always loved storytelling. So the telling of life stories, I am fascinated by. I think it's why I like to watch very bad reality TV, because I am fascinated by the stories that people tell about themselves and about others. And so I think actually it's the only profession that I could have ended up going into. But I think that with this awareness of my grandfather, what that was like, a curiosity about alternative manifestations or different manifestations of kind of, different conditions, and sort of with that exposure to the psychiatric space, I think all of that did draw me to this idea of, well, actually, I'm fascinated by story. I enjoy the endeavor of being present to people that I care about. Caring and loving comes very easily to me. I'm also very drawn towards healing professions. This for me feels like it makes a lot of sense. And so I applied for clinical masters, I think in my second year of a master's by thesis in psychology, which was focused on life story research and on how people embody their life worlds. So that was, and I applied at my university at Rhodes, and was lucky enough to have been selected. And I then entered into a realm that I think sometimes, I say this jokingly, but I think if people are actually informed what it means to become a clinical psychologist or what is involved, they probably wouldn't want to go into the training, as kind of with like fresh and sort of naive eyes as I think I did go into.
I think it's very important that you mention that, Claire, because a lot of people don't realize that, a psychology degree is not an easy degree. You've got to get through. You've postgraduate, you have to do honors, you have to do masters, and to just get selected for the master's program is a process on its own. But even more so, once you've completed that master's, you still have internship or community service, depending on the type of psych. It's not like a lot of other degrees where once you've gotten the BCom, you're A for away. There are the other steps that have to take place. And that's what makes psychologists such highly educated people, which I suppose is why they are able to help people in the way that they are, because they didn't just go to school for 5 years and get a degree that's it, they're happy to go. You had to fight to become a psychologist. And that, I think, is what a lot of people need to understand and remember. It was that fight to get there.
I agree. I think there's a lot of risk involved if you are opting to decide to become a psychologist. And I think I have certainly taught undergrad psychology, and I'm struck that it feels like every second or third person is wanting to become a psychologist. And there's this fresh kind of dewy sense of what this endeavor is like. And I think that there are a number of things. There's the practical, pragmatic thing of that selection processes are rigorous, and it's 8 to 10 people out of about 400 applicants. And so when you're applying, you have to appreciate that you may not get in the first time, you may not get in the second time, you may not get in. And I think if one is quite passionate about it, there is something to be said for being driven by what you are passionate about. But I also think that the endeavor of becoming a psychologist, like you said, it's not only about getting the degree. I think people may differ on this. This is only my opinion and my experience. I see being a psychologist as a way of being in the world. I can switch it off, and I endeavor to be very real in my interactions with human beings. So I try not to play the role of psychologist in spaces outside of my therapeutic work. But even in my therapeutic work, I feel like being a clinical psychologist is essentially the endeavor to have the courage and to be really brave, to risk becoming more authentic and more genuine. Obviously, you work within the boundaries and the parameters that ensure safety of practice, but there is something to be said for this work which is ongoing. You don't get a degree and then you're done and dusted. It's an ongoing learning process. And I think for me, the learning that I acquire from the clients that I work with is just, to be given the honor and the privilege of coming close to somebody's most vulnerable parts. That is a privilege. It's not your right, even as a psychologist. I don't think that's even a right necessarily, just because we embody that label or that position.
Yeah, I think that's the amazing part. What you said was, constantly learning, being so, such a resource, to people, and sharing their intimate details, and knowing them sometimes better than they know themselves in certain circumstances. I think is amazing. And I think once, like, psychologists almost like, they figure out the self-preservation part, like don't burn yourself out and all of those kind of things, and you can get that balance right. I think then it does become like that, where you could almost like see yourself. This is from not me, from other people telling me this, but where they can see themselves doing this all the way until later on in life. But for me, the reality, of what you just said now about how people don't really realize what they're getting into, was my wife's a Clinical Psych, and I remember her first paycheck from salary, from Tara. And it was, after like 7-8 years of study, and you look at this paycheck, it's like, really? That's what you earn? It's like, and obviously me being in IT, it was like crazy. But I think there's a certain sense of like, people need to know. And I think anyone listening to this and wants to become a psychologist or an architect or archaeologist, whatever you want to become, like maybe go and find out, those kind of things. So that you don't spend like 8 years and then get surprised about, what it could be. I thought that was very interesting.
It is, and I think it's also, it's a difficult one because there's something quite elusive about the process of learning more about what it's like to work as a psychologist, because of course there are all the boundaries around clients and protecting their privacy and their confidentiality. And so the idea of, like work shadowing just looks very different from really the way in which one learns is through conversation, with relevant individuals. But I think the learning, I think that part is difficult because I'm also struck that I think one does take, I hate to, some people may really disagree with this, but I do feel a little bit like I dived in with my eyes closed. I had a sense, not quite, if anyone told me, I will say to you that, if anyone had said to me how admin heavy this job is, I think I would have been like, no, man, that's how can that be true? But admin is my very best friend, not my best friend, but it's, intimate part of my life on a daily basis. And I think because psychology is often wrapped with a lot of, there's a lot of idealized, sort of romanticized versions. I think media has probably kind of sort of pushed that along quite a lot. But, and I think also working in the South African context, I do feel like we have a responsibility to also kind of, engage quite creatively within sort of the community spaces, within what it means to practice in South African context. Because it's a complex context to work in. Yeah,
100%. I think you went down the admin private practice route, but I'd love to know how you, I call it dark arts because it's like definitely it doesn't seem to be very intuitive how people kind of stumble onto private practice, but it does seem to happen at some point. But was there, did you work, obviously you had to do community service, and then after that did you work in another practice or in a government institution and then go into private practice, or did you go straight into private practice?
Private practice is very new for me, actually. So a good 5 years or so, I would say. I'm just trying to think. I think private practice proper, actually, I lie, was 2019, where I took the final kind of like jump into it. I've been practicing for, I think now 14 years, I think. So I did my ComServe in 2007. And then I did it in the Eastern Cape, which was an incredibly enriching experience. I grew up in the Eastern Cape, but I think one learns to be very creative in spaces where there's not a lot of infrastructure and not a lot of support really available. But in that process and in working with the community, a sort of rural coastal community, I think I've always been drawn very much towards the idea of psychology being more accessible to a larger proportion of individuals. And so I was looking for work. The reality of that is that I needed an income and I needed to be able to support myself. And there was a post that opened up at Stellenbosch University at their student counselling centre. And I applied there and I got the post as a clinical psychologist, kind of sort of professional support staff in the counselling unit. And I worked there for about 4 years. And then I actually moved to UCT, to their student wellness, where I worked for them from 2011 to the end of 2017, beginning of 2018. And my idea was that I think partly because I've never quite given up on the idea that I am a student. So I love students and I love working with students and I love the university context. I think it's got to do with the fact that my dad is an academic and I grew up on a campus and roads, and I just, and I resonated with it and it felt safe for me. And I loved working with young adults, but But more importantly, my conscious decision of staying in that space was that it provided an immense amount of learning, but also made therapy quite accessible to a demographic of students who otherwise wouldn't be able to access psychotherapeutic support. And I really loved working in that space. And it was possibly, I still miss those spaces. I really love working in those spaces because it is the closest that I get to being able to engage in a sense of at least practicing within broader contexts, and also being challenged to practice in ways that also, like my subject position as, embodying a very particular representation of identity in the South African context, however that is experienced by other diverse identities. I find that working with young adults, especially in university spaces, where, bearing in mind, 2015, we had Fees Must Fall, students were becoming increasingly increasingly motivated towards having the difficult conversations around what it means for you to be, how do you understand my experience if you're a white middle class therapist? And I found those experiences so incredibly enlivening and taught me a lot about being really authentic in this space, being accountable, checking one's internalized stereotypes, etc. So that was kind of what happened. And then I also formed a part of training, clinical master's training program at Stellenbosch University, and then also was not permanent, I was a contract full-time lecturer at UWC, and also on their clinical master's training program. And so I did supervision, so psychodynamic and cognitive supervision, and also taught group psychotherapy, and then contextual theory, so Marxist theory and contextual theory on the practice of psychology in SA. And then at some point, I think, because I am also a mom, and I, working in university contexts and working at the level and pace with which I was working, so seeing anything up to 6 students a day, not really having a lot of choice around the cases that I take on. So potentially holding a lot of kind of trauma-related cases, a lot of kind of fragile process. I was feeling quite burnt out, and I was thinking I really need a way of being able to generate an income, but also I need more time. I need time for myself. I need time for my family. And so I started a very small little private practice on the side in Stellenbosch at the time. And that started in probably about 2016. And it was very small, and it kind of ticked along, and I kept going in other spaces. And then in 2018, I made the conscious decision to, all right, I now want to move into practice spaces and pursue this idea of private practice. But I was quite fearful of losing like a formal income and working for myself. And so I did this fancy footwork where I was working, I think at the time I was working at UWC, and then I also started to explore kind of doing a little bit of consultancy for a practice, a neuropsychology practice, and then my own private practice. And then in 2019, I thought to myself, well, I am going to now bite the bullet, make this leap. I'm not sure how, because I think you were mentioning that, sort of doesn't really always, I think before the show, you're saying it doesn't always really seem like there's a logical kind of, people sort of leap and go, I'm going to do this now. And I just had this moment where I thought it's either, how do I want it to do life? Do I want to be surviving, or do I want to be thriving? And so I then opted to, I started consulting at an addiction treatment unit, Bloemendal, and then carried on my little private practice. And then COVID hit. And then I thought, well, the SH1T has really hit the fan now, because now what do I do? Because Bloemendal was a Dutch-based clinic. And so all our patients had to be repatriated in April of 2020. The whole unit shut down. And so I think I lost probably about 3/4 of my income at that time. And then was hit with, right, so what is this? We're going to have an online practice. And I think most I think safely to say, I think most clinical psychologists, especially those that work psychodynamically, which I do, probably kind of go, online practice, you've got to be kidding me. Like, how do you work with the intersubjective dynamics across the virtual space? Can't see the person, this isn't going to work. And I guess context and circumstance pushed me into this space, and I have felt so incredibly blessed. I felt so very lucky, because it worked out really very well. But there was some marketing that needed to happen around that. But yeah, and now I'm fully in private practice and working for myself, and I'm not sure that I'd want to work for anybody in a formal sense again. I shouldn't say that out loud. Sorry. Okay.
Can't say it loud.
But really enjoy, I think I just enjoy the agency and the autonomy around that. I can make choices about who I see and how I see. And I can also have a few kind of more pro bono type, sessions. And I have a little bit more freedom of movement, and that's really lovely.
Yeah, Claire, I love that story because it really embodies the fact that as clinical psychologists, even when all the chips are down, you guys somehow, through some sort of black magic, manage to get these businesses working. I mean, chips are down, you've lost 3/4 of your income, COVID has hit, you suddenly have to figure out how to make up 3/4 of your income using weird and wonderful technologies to actually get it done. And the fact that you made it work is really phenomenal. So I have one question for you. If you could go back now and tell younger Claire one thing about starting a private practice, what would that be?
I think, and this is based on really what I've learned in this process, I think that to really, because I don't feel, when you say you made it work, what immediately came up for me was I was thinking, man, I have an immense kind of community of individuals who have really assisted me in helping to make this work, and trust from other professionals, and that for me is very humbling, because I think actually there's something about that perhaps my younger version of self, that that younger version, and this version too, I will fully admit, I tend to want to do things on my own. I tend to I've learned how to be very self-sufficient in life. Life experience has required that I be able to manage and cope on my own. It's difficult to ask for help. And actually I get quite emotional when I think about this, because part of what COVID really brought up was the reaching out and trusting the connections that I had formed over more than a decade's worth of working, and realizing that people see you, that I think sometimes we think when we go into private practice that, I think it can feel like quite an insular little sort of thing. And I think sometimes in professional communities, and I think also if you're starting out, don't always know a lot of people, there's something really important about facilitating connection. I feel very lucky that I had worked in many spaces in which I had many colleagues through which, who knew me and who I could connect with. And there was a sense of, just having built up and nurturing sort of quite actively. I don't know that I've ever marketed myself, but certainly this idea of nurturing the connections that one forms with professionals that you resonate with and you identify with, being curious about meeting new professionals, being brave enough to put yourself out there, and, not even in a brazen, like business-like sense, but just kind of sending a mail and saying, hi, I've heard you work in this particular context. I was wondering whether you'd be wanting to kind of meet and have coffee, or, the number of, even in COVID times, last night I actually had to connect with a new professional who I need to hand over some clients to, and I'm quite particular about handover of clients that I need to refer on. And I have a sense of her, but I don't know her that well. And last night we couldn't meet in person because our schedules have been too hectic. but we both poured a glass of wine and met over a Zoom session and had a really lovely chat. But this is how I think sometimes we forget as professionals that we're also, we're humans, and we can utilize our humanity, and we don't always have to be super professional in order to also nurture our professional identities. That sounds a bit weird, but yeah, I guess. Yeah.
No, it makes a lot of sense. I like what you said earlier in the conversation, about stories and how enamored you are about it. I've always, and I still like Donald Miller. He talks about building the story brand, but he talks about the hero's journey. And actually, I was looking, earlier there's a book I just finished listening to it. I'm a huge Audible fan. And he talks about hero on a mission, and he talks about, us in our lives, how we at different points, we're either the hero or the victim, or we the the protagonist, and stuff like that. And what I find, with the private practice discussion, almost all practitioners always tell us that this guide appears, and the guide doesn't have to be a single person. Sometimes, like what you're saying now, sometimes it's a few people that actually helps them along the way. And I thought that's amazing, because you kind of collaborate to that story. And it's with like looking at or working with many practitioners over the last many years. That's the one thing that's amazing about it. It's almost like they help each other in those first years. I know there's a competitive aspect to it as well, which lots of people don't speak about, but there's also that helping part, which is amazing.
It is amazing. I think for new practitioners that are entering into private practice, I think kind of as new individuals, I think about living in a small town. And I think that in some ways it's interesting, because as with any group, there will be the dynamic of support and kind of forming alliances, and there will, of course, also be the shadow side of that, which is a wariness of newcomers and a fear of newcomers. And so I think that it is a process. And I think that process, advice to a new, or sort of to my younger self, would be also trust and be patient that you will find your individuals. You may not find them immediately. You may need to seek out many different kinds of spaces, but endeavor to stay curious and connect. Fear shuts down curiosity. When we're starting a practice or we're starting a business, I think it's very easy to get into a fear-based place. I think especially with COVID, I know I went into that space, and it shuts down the curiosity to explore and to kind of think creatively. And so one can endeavor to stay curious, and always be one or two individuals. I mean, I started off with a supervisor who I trusted implicitly, and he's been my supervisor for over a decade, but he was my island of support as I started. And so this web starts to kind of unfold and connect.
It's amazing how psychologists or healthcare professionals in general tend to work closely with each other, and, like you said, build out this web of assistance. I am, however, going to go back to something you said a little bit earlier, was you did not realize how admin heavy this profession was going to be. So I have to ask, do you use any billing software to help with the admin, or are you still in the Word and Excel admin phase?
Thank God, not quite there. I have a practice manager, actually. So I don't have, for example, I don't have an admin assistant or reception as such. So I manage bookings, and I kind of do a lot of my cash invoicing. I do myself. I must admit, I have a template. So I think that's a little bit better than like Word and Excel. I don't know, but I do actually have an Excel page where I note my expenses, or at least invoicing over the month, just to keep track of the cash invoicing. But my practice manager does a lot of the medical aid submissions and queries. And I find that if I didn't have her, she's a little bit like my guardian angel, because if I didn't have her, I don't think I would, I think I would just be flailing and drowning, because even just sending out cash invoices for me can sometimes, I've had moments where I've said to her, we're probably going to need to look at that one because I don't know that I can sustain this any longer. Because it's admin heavy. I mean, just invoicing, never mind that you need to write reports and session notes and, you know, letters and kind of P&B motivations, and there's a lot of admin, right? But just invoicing in and of itself, I think sometimes takes me on average about 2 to 3 hours a week. But I do, my practice manager then obviously as we use a Panacea, I think it is, as a billing system, and then doing medical aid submissions that way. Yeah.
That's amazing. Does she also do the unpaid management as well? Because you know, I think that's the thing that, you know, it's always rosy and it's almost like seems to be okay, and you know, like especially as she has asked now, you know, like once you get the software, and there's amazing, you know, alternatives now in the market. You know, it's actually okay. But what people don't speak about is the unpaid management. And, you know, us as a company, I mean, when we came out with the billing software, you know, that was easy. And then as we started seeing the trends, we found most practices, actually, there's about like a 5 to 20% of their practice doesn't get paid, which is a significant amount. I mean, if you think about, you know, psychology rates and stuff like that. Does she do that as well? And I mean, is unpaid is it a no-show, as in a, you know, you don't have that issue?
I must admit I've been very lucky. I've had 1 or 2 kind of sort of defaulters, perhaps, you know, in the last, I would say in the last 3 years or so, I can think of like 1 or 2. And not, you know, I guess there's the sort of notion of bad debt or kind of, you know, some sort of nothing that I would say is really substantial. I do know that certainly in instances where there has been some reluctance to follow through with payment, my practice manager will often deal with that. I prefer to have an interface between myself and the client, because of course, given how I work interpersonally and dynamically, it all has to come into the therapy space. And so I probably a little defensive on my part, but I struggle with that part, and I want to create a boundary between myself and that aspect in particular. It would still need to be spoken about in therapy, but it gets spoken about obviously in slightly different ways. And in that context, I don't want to be wearing the hat of therapist, person who's sending out the invoices, and then person who is following up and hounding you or having conversations with you about your unpaid invoice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a commonality that almost all practitioners share. There's very few. I mean, I've met a few, or we've met a few on the show, but most of those come from like almost an admin background. You know, so they worked in admin before, and so they don't have any issues, you know, with that type of conversation. But for the large part, you know, practitioners hate that discussion, and I use that word as well because that seems to be the trend. Yeah, I mean, is there a certain secret to that? I mean, because I do want to make it actionable as well. I mean, like, you know, so for the aspects where it is working, do you have any, you know, no, I won't say secret, but do you have any advice around unpaid management that you think, you know, other practitioners could benefit from, or anyone considering private practice?
Sure. I mean, I think because of how I work, so I think because I also endeavor to be very transparent with my clients, so there is a clear understanding also in the beginning. So, you know, I think informed consent is one of the most important things, obviously, from an ethical perspective in terms of working with clients. And so I have an information document that will also outline, you know, payment options, kind of how that will sort of play out. Also on my invoice, I do place the sort of, I guess, a little bit of a clause which notes that the invoice needs to be paid within 7 days of reception of the invoice. And then what I will do is, for some clients who, I mean, because you have some clients who genuinely just in the busyness of life have kind of neglected or forgotten about, a therapy invoice. And so I will mid month, so sort of a good, another 7 days after the 7 days, kind of just do a WhatsApp or a message or an email where I will just, and I you can see the discomfort even in how I phrase it. I'll send a message saying, just send a gentle reminder about the unsettled invoice from, and that seems to, but I think just the follow through and the consistency. And I think also the understanding that I am transparent with you in this space, and we are quite, so although I find those conversations very hard, I don't avoid them. And so I kind of, because I endeavor for us to stay transparent and open and honest with each other. This is a space that needs to feel safe and it needs to feel productive. So I think those are the things that probably assist in some way.
Yeah, well said. I mean, I think that would be our bet. That would be our stance on it as well, which was, what you said, consistency, that open communication, and it's almost like, and transparency, so people know exactly what they're expecting. But what I find is the follow through, it's like what you said, firstly, you have to have that open conversation, but then you have to make sure that, 7 days after it's not paid, you send that, consistently, and, either you're quite diligent about it or you use a system to do it, or, whatever that is. But I mean, psychologists do this well. It's a boundary kind of thing, and you need to have all of those things in place. My last question, and then I think we can close up. We also use this, as an opportunity to almost like understand how we could be better. And when I say we, I mean we as a company. So over the last few episodes, I think it was the one practitioner that spurred us on, and she said, I wish that when we were starting out, we had billing software as an example, and because we can't just pay for it, it's like, although it's, now, I mean, even the ones that you mentioned, they're about 700 rands a month, and when you're starting out, it's difficult to justify that expense. Is there anything that we can do as a, as someone that works with practitioners differently, maybe to help out in the earlier days of private practice?
I mean, it's so difficult because I don't really feel that informed around kind of how these systems really work. I mean, I trust my practice manager and her sense of how these systems work. So I have to admit, I feel somewhat sort of naive and misinformed. But I will say that I think, I understand, I gather from, in terms of my practice manager, what I have come to the understanding of is that, I don't know that if a large group of people could utilize, but I assume that this is actually how it works, that if more and more people utilize a particular system of billing, that the charges become a lot less in terms of that. I think so. One pays less per month in terms of the billing, but I'm not sure if that is how it is.
Yeah, not from a subscription point, from what I know,
Okay.
but definitely maybe from a volume point of view. If that's what she said, I think maybe if you submit, I don't know, like 200 claims, maybe your submissions to medical aid, that rate comes down depending on the service provider, but not, to my understanding, it's not the subscription. I think it varies, with the different providers. And if I ask the question maybe a different way, is if we almost like gave the solutions out to practitioners when they're starting out, at a much discounted rate, do you think that would help? I know the obvious answer would be probably okay.
I do, because I think most practitioners are quite, and also something, I almost imagine that people would probably subscribe quite extensively to like webinars that really just outline how some of this sort of stuff works, because I think like me, for example, I mean, as I've said to you, I mean, I've kind of outsourced that knowledge to my practice manager. It's not me that actually understands the ins and outs of this, and probably that would do me well as well. But, I think to really understand why it's necessary, because certainly for me, when I started out, I was very wary of getting involved in that because of the costs and because I didn't quite understand how it all worked. So I ended up doing a cash-based practice, which actually I realized once I got onto the system, it's not really, from a financial perspective, you can really make things work a lot more kind of effectively when you are utilizing medical aids. And it also makes it easier for people to access therapy, because people aren't always willing or able to pay the cash rate, for example, even on a sliding scale. So I think the lack of knowledge, the naivety, I think to kind of really promote that, and then discounted sort of options, even if it's like a little bit like when you download an application and you get the kind of free version and then you get the kind of premium version. That's something that affords some basic principles that would really assist. And then, you buy into that. And if that really works, you can then kind of subscribe in a more committed way, whatever it might be. I think that's because I think that beginning sort of sense of committing to private practice, even, I mean, that was this ginger kind of fear around what it means to dive in completely. I think that would be a nice option.
Cool. Thank you. I mean, for those thoughts, and I know it sounds like the most obvious thing, but for us as a I don't want to reduce functionality as an example. I want to, because we know that if you get the software, you are going to be better. I mean, you use the example of medical aids, like PMBs. If you don't have the software to do PMB submissions, how do you get those type of clients? Would be a good example. Of one of those things. Notes was another one. But I think we can definitely close up. I mean, my last question was, is there anything around this topic, around being a psychologist or going into private practice, that you thought we should have asked you that we didn't?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head right now. No.
Okay, cool. So let's leave it there then. Thanks very much for your time. Thanks for agreeing to this. I mean, we really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. It was lovely to meet the two of you in person.
Thank you very much, Claire. It was amazing to meet you as well.
Pleasure, Shad. Thank you.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening. As always, stay tuned and we'll speak to you in the next episode.